Recording? Okay, good. We are now recording. It didn't tell me I'm recording, but it looks like it is. Let's try sharing again. And welcome to all of you who are able to tune in to Reading 350 Week 2. Thank you for joining us. This is Dr. Slay, and we have a full agenda of things to talk about that I hope will support the work that you are doing and that you're going to be reading about in your book today or this week, that hopefully you have started reading, because I know this chapter 1 is dense. It's theory. It's a lot of general broad. It's a survey course, so there's so much information that might be kind of new to you, at least in thinking this way about how our brain learns to read. So that's what we're going to try to go over a few key ideas, and then that will lead us into the 2 assignments that you have to do this week, which are 2 discussions. So let us get started. I'm actually going to start with a read aloud. I like to start all my classes with a read aloud, but because we're doing this via online, I'm not going to read it to you because it's really, it makes it weird. And other people have done really good jobs of turning pages and such, so I'm going to let them take over as we read this story called Crowboy. Crowboy was written, I believe, in 1986, or maybe it's 83. Anyway, it's a little bit old, and you're going to see from the pictures that it is no longer current in terms of the images and the way those things are designed, because our technology has advanced so much. But the story is valid as we think about the conditions in which children learn to read, children go to school. So I'm just going to let this narrator read the story to you. That will lead us into a presentation of a lot of the content that we have that I'll just cover quickly with you. And then I'll be asking you to think about that at the end. Given that it's a small group and you are online, some of you will be reading this later or watching this later. We won't extensively discuss it unless anyone wants to chime in toward the end. It's just a way for us to get ourselves started as we think about where we're going as teachers and the conditions under which our students learn to read.
Crowboy. On the first day of our village school in Japan, there was a boy missing. He was found hidden away in the dark space underneath the schoolhouse floor. None of us knew him. He was nicknamed Chibi because he was very small. Chibi means tiny boy. The strange boy was afraid of our teacher and could not learn a thing. He was afraid of the children and could not make friends with them at all. He was left alone in the study time. He was left alone in the playtime. He was always at the end of the line, always at the foot of the class, a forlorn little tag-along. Soon, Chibi began to make his eyes cross-eyed, so that he was able not to see whatever he did not want to see. And Chibi found many ways, one after another, to kill time and amuse himself. Just the ceiling was interesting enough for him to watch for hours. The wooden top of his desk was another thing interesting to watch. A patch of cloth on a boy's shoulder was something to study. Of course, the window showed him many things all year round. Even when it was raining, the window had surprising things to show him. On the playground, if he closed his eyes and listened, Chibi could hear many different sounds near and far. And Chibi could hold and watch insects and grubs that most of us wouldn't touch or even look at. So that not only the children in our class, but the older ones and even the younger ones called him stupid and slowpoke. But slowpoke or not, day after day, Chibi came trudging to school. He always carried the same lunch, a rice ball wrapped in a radish leaf. Even when it rained or stormed, he still came trudging along, wrapped in a raincoat made from dried zebra grass. And so day by day, 5 years went by, and we were in the 6th grade, the last class in school. Our new teacher was Mr. Isaac. He was a friendly man with a kind smile. Mr. Isaac often took his class to the hilltop behind the school. He was pleased to learn that Chibi knew all the places where the wild grapes and wild potatoes grew. He was amazed to find how much Chibi knew about all the flowers in our class garden. He liked Chibi's black and white drawings and tacked them up on the wall to be admired. He liked Chibi's own handwriting, which no one but Chibi could read, and he tacked that up on the wall. And he often spent time talking with Chibi when no one was around. But when Chibi appeared on the stage at the talent show of that year, no one could believe his eyes. Who is that? What can that stupid do up there? Until Mr. Isaac announced that Chibi was going to imitate the voices of crows. Voices? Voices of crows? Voices of crows? Voices of crows. First, he imitated the voices of newly hatched crows, and he made the mother crow's voice. Then he imitated the father crow's voice. He showed how crows cry early in the morning. He showed how crows cry when the village people have some unhappy accident. He showed how crows call when they are happy and gay. Everybody's mind was taken to the far mountainside from which Chibi probably came to the school. At the end, to imitate a crow on an old tree, Chibi made very special sounds deep down in his throat. Wah! Wah! Now, everybody could imagine exactly the far and lonely place where Chibi lived with his family. Then Mr. Isaac explained how Chibi had learned those calls, leaving his home for school at dawn and arriving home at sunset every day for 6 long years. Every one of us cried, thinking how much we had been wrong to Chibi all those long years. Even grown-ups wiped their eyes, saying, yes, yes, he is wonderful. Soon after that came graduation day. Chibi was the only one in our class honored for perfect attendance through all the 6 years. After school was over, the big boys would often have work to do in the village for their families. Sometimes Chibi came to the village to sell the charcoal he and his family made. But nobody called him Chibi anymore. We all called him Crow Boy. Hi, Crow Boy. Crow Boy would nod and smile as if he liked the name. And when his work was done, he would buy a few things for his family. Then he would set off for his home on the far side of the mountain, stretching his growing shoulders proudly like a grown-up man. And from around the turn of the mountain road would come a crow call, the happy one. The end.
So you can see we have a story of a young man that has learned and brought different kinds of talents to class. So think about Chibi, who came to be known as Crow Boy, and think about the implications for the kinds of students you might have in your class. The implications of what it's going to take for that student to feel welcome and to be able to learn to read. And then think about that in today's climate. So even though the book may be outdated in terms of having been published in the 80s, it's still a story that may be relevant to us in our own ways, especially in our multicultural world. So just something to ponder as we move forward. And whoops, let me get to the right, there we go. The big question that you're going to be pondering this week, and actually for the whole semester, is, oh, I went too fast. How do you teach reading effectively? Well, one of the big things that you're going to be thinking about this week, and hopefully you had a chance to start with the article from last week that I posted, is that are tremendous implications about how we learn to read that we found through brain science. And there are actually books and articles and studies and such called that have to do with reading and the brain. And these images here are meant to show you that all of the areas of the brain are fired up in some way, particularly 3 areas. You've got the area in the front, in the frontal lobe, and that's where you have that, they call that the executive function right up here. And that's where sound and speech and input are input, and those things affect, think about it, sound and speech. There's your phonemic awareness. That's this very important area that reading begins from what we hear and what we learn to speak from our language. Then it moves, there's another very important area called the parietal lobe, a little bit farther back, maybe up here where we kind of put our buns on our head. And we talk about that as being the word analysis or sound symbol connection. So we're getting to something a little bit more structured. Maybe we start thinking about, oh, the rules of reading, the rules of phonics and such. And that starts to become influenced with that language area that we know is really important to reading development. As you're moving through, you start to then go further back into the back of your head, maybe right above your neck, and you begin to see that there's the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, and we begin to recognize that the brain is processing in that part of your head or your brain letter and word recognition. So maybe we're dealing a little bit more with memory, and it's beginning to make connections between these other areas of the brain as it's looking at the analysis of words, what it's heard, and begin to make sense out of it as it begins to get rewired. And all of this, of course, is influenced by this concept of comprehension, because reading is an influence of our language. So that's a very simplistic view, but it's something that's really important to think about that has influenced the way we teach reading today. And part of the work you will do this week is to explore that a little bit more in some videos that I'm going to be asking, perhaps you've already begun to look at. So chapter 1 really does talk about becoming an effective reading teacher. And it says that there's 8 theories, or there's 8, the better word is 8 principles that you put into place to become an effective reader or teacher of reading. So number 1, you need to be knowledgeable about learning theory. So we'll go over a few of those theories today. And the book, of course, goes into that. Number 2, you create a community of learners. Number 3, you support the use of cueing systems, and I'll mention what those are. Those cueing systems affect all of those different areas of your brain that we just saw in those images. You adopt a balanced approach to literacy instruction. That's going to be a little controversial now that the science of teaching reading has surfaced, and you're going to be taking this test. And so I hope to clarify a little bit about that in our presentation today. Number 5, you scaffold students' reading and writing. So you're constantly finding ways to support students according to how they learn. You're very organized, not just being organized because you know where your materials are, but you've got to be very explicit in how you teach reading, which is why you organize for instruction, which means you're also differentiating if you're going to meet the Chibis of the world. And you link instruction and assessment, which is something, of course, that is very much a part of the classrooms that we see today, because assessment does drive instruction. So let's talk first about that thing that I just mentioned, and that is this idea of what is balanced instruction. I'm going to let one of the authors of the book talk a little bit about balanced literacy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Akabon. And I'm Nancy Fry. And we're here today to talk about our book, This is Balanced Literacy. We're very excited. Doug Fisher is a co-author with us as well, but we're very excited to be able to talk about the many different.
I have to stop for just a second because these are not the authors of the book that you're reading, but they are authors of a book called What is Balanced Literacy? And I do remember that I pulled this clip because I thought they did the very best idea of representing that holistic view of balanced literacy in terms of an approach for teaching reading as opposed to a set of rules. So you're going to hear various things, but I think this is the one I want you to stick with. And that is an excellent book. It's not the book you're reading.
Ways in which literacy becomes a balanced literacy approach in elementary classrooms. It's come so far since those early ways in which we thought about balanced literacy instruction. It was either whole language or phonics. Remember those days?
I remember those
right?
days.
And it has gotten much more sophisticated and nuanced in the decades since then.
The idea of balanced literacy has been with us for a couple of decades. As far as I can tell, as far as I can remember, the idea of balanced literacy was introduced in the reading war days. We're having a war between how much phonics versus kind of how much whole language we should have in a classroom. And there's a lot of debate on this with people on either side. And the balanced literacy movement was an attempt to say both are important. We have to develop student skills and we have to develop their love of literature and to learn to read in authentic ways. And they can't be seen as competing priorities as children learn to read.
Balanced literacy has so many different definitions. I think traditionally it's been thought of as being a mix between reading and writing. And certainly there's a connection and there's a relationship there. But when we think about balance, we also think about other elements. For example, what is the division between how much time students are spending in dialogic instruction versus the kind of teacher modeling that they need versus independent learning? That's another way that we think about balance.
Nancy, I agree. I think another way we can think about balance is a whole group to small group. Students need whole group instruction, but if they're not receiving small group instruction, then they're not receiving help on needs that they have specifically.
Another element around balanced literacy is thinking about the kinds of text that they have available to them and the kind of text that they're composing. We want children, of course, to be engaged with narrative forms of writing and of reading, but we also want them to be able to read and write, to be able to gain information, and we want them to be able to state their opinions in their writing and also be able to understand when opinions are being utilized in the text that they're reading as well.
I think a new part or a more modern way of thinking about balanced literacy is we really added in the thinking. So it's reading, writing, and thinking about text that you're reading and about text that you're reading.
In most classrooms, reading gets a huge amount of the instructional minutes and writing gets very little. One of my colleagues said to me years and years ago, every writer can read, but not every reader can write. We're not spending enough time helping kids compose and learn to compose and be taught to compose. And today, for most people, balanced literacy is about the instructional repertoires that teachers use. So you have your whole class instruction, your small group instruction, perhaps your collaborative learning with students, and certainly your independent experiences for kids. So today, for most people, balanced literacy has to do with things like shared readings and guided readings and independent readings and those kinds of things. Yes, all the literacy processes are important. We want phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, oral language, and writing. All of that is important in balance. Informational texts are important, so are narratives. Direct instruction, dialogic instruction, important. Writing, reading, important. And how you structure time in the classroom has to be balanced. It can't be all teacher control, and it can't be all student control. We have to balance that teachers sometimes are modeling, sometimes students are collaborating, sometimes they're being guided, sometimes they're doing things independently. So the idea of balance is to find that just right balance that allows every single kid to achieve their potential.
I've always liked that video because I think it expressed best that sense of balance through all of the elements of reading that you're going to find that's not saying that that it encompasses things such as brain research, the science of teaching reading, all of the different structures that go into becoming a good reader, including phonics, the sociocultural elements, as well as the comprehension. So let's go on to the next slide. Another important term that you're going to be hearing from this day forward is this science of teaching reading. For those of you that are already exposed to classrooms, you know that this is something that's a big deal going on in schools, but it's also many teachers that have not been instructed with this way of thinking are going through academies, and you, of course, will have to pass a test to become certified as well. So this course will talk some of this, but Reading 360, which is the next course in the sequence, will be all about phonics instruction. But I want you to notice what Doug Fisher just said a few minutes ago, and he listed all of those elements. And look again at what these elements are in what's called the Scarborough's reading rope. Scarborough is a researcher that came up with this term in relation. You can give C credit, it was to Goff and Tuners, but which is this concept of the simple view of reading. Some people think of, and I was raised in the tradition of the idea that reading is complex. And I stick to that. Reading is complex, but the simple view of reading is much like this rope, where all of these very different strands, background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy, knowledge, word recognition, elements of phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition, all of those things are very explicitly taught. So they're not blended, they're taught in isolation, sometimes in isolation, but not necessarily in isolation to the point that you're not also teaching other things at some point in your reading program. So it's increasingly strategic so that your reading becomes increasingly automatic. And then you become a skilled reader when all of those strands of the rope intertwine. So that's why the science of teaching reading is based on brain science, that neurological science of understanding how the brain works, and that it really does rewire itself in order to develop skilled readers. So I mentioned earlier that there are 8 principles, so let's quickly go through them. Principle number 1, effective teachers are knowledgeable about learning. Well, that means that effective teachers understand that there's 4 main theories: behaviorism, information processing, constructivism, and sociolinguistics. I'm going to argue that we do a little bit of all of them. One of them may predominate, and I'm going to ask you to think about that. Which one is the strongest? Which one, and this is going to be part of your one of your discussion prompts, which one of these, or which several of these learning theories are you most experienced in? How did you learn to read? And when you think about it, it might be how did you learn to read when you were very young, but you continue to learn how to become more literate as you grew older and you went through school. Did the theory of how you learn to read change depending on your teacher, depending on your environment, depending on you and what was needed? So the first one is behaviorism. And this is very teacher-centered. When I think of behaviorism, I think of B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner was really big. He was a psychologist, I guess, I'm not sure, but he was a scientist that was very dominant in the 1950s. And when we think of behaviorism, we think of stimulus response. We think that you teach things explicitly in sequential order. Now, I want you to recognize that the science of teaching reading it's explicit, but it doesn't always have to be sequential. It's very explicit in the strategies that it teaches, though there's a little bit of a difference, although there's a lot of overlap with behaviorism. It's very much worksheet driven. It's the days when I was a kid and I sat in all straight rows in my in my little Catholic school in our individual desks, and we were meant to be quiet, and we filled out boxes and we colored in the picture that matched the sounds and such. So I learned phonics, but I did not learn it. I learned it silently, believe it or not, which I don't know, that doesn't make any sense to me anymore. So it is really very much a behavior controlled system through rewards and punishment. So and punishment sounds really harsh, but you know, you do something or there's a consequence. So it's a very much of a bottoms up approach, and its basic goal is word recognition when you're dealing with reading. It talks about being able to recognize things, and then you leave it at that. Constructivism is the next theory. In constructivism, this goes a little bit, it's a little bit different. It's not so much stimulus response. However, in this case, oh, by the way, in behaviorism, the teacher's in control. In constructivism, students are more in control. Now, I want you to think about this in terms of what you will see in schools. Look for elements of constructivism. Look for elements of who's in charge of the learning. Is it the teacher, or is it the student, or is it a combination? In constructivism, think of the word construction. Students are active and engaged learners who construct their own knowledge. Teachers engage them with experiences so they can construct their own knowledge. Think about learning centers. Think about science experiments. Think about opportunities where children are learning through discovery, as opposed to filling out a worksheet. Important theorists include Jean Piaget, which you've probably read about or heard about in some of your psychology courses. There's John Dewey, and there's Albert Bandura. All of these three people have talked about, well, and Bandura talks about self-efficacy, in which children are in charge of their own learning because they take control. John Dewey talks about exploration, and that learning should be collaborative and not competitive. And of course, Jean Piaget talks about the modification of schema, which is what students' experiences that influence how they learn and what they learn. So it's very much different from behaviorism because it's top down. And so therefore the reading instruction all leads to meaning and developing. The goal is to comprehend. And by the way, phonics is important, and I will always support the instruction of phonics, but not in isolation. The other thing that I will always support is the teaching of phonics in order to facilitate the ability to read the words and make sense of them. But the end goal, and I encourage you to all write this down, the reason we read at the end of the day is to comprehend. Sociolinguistics is another theory that you're going to hear a lot about. This one came through this a scientist called Lev Vygotsky, and he was a Russian psychologist who died very, very young because of the illnesses in the 20s. I think he had contracted tuberculosis and died very young before he became famous. He didn't become famous until the 1970s. The other thing is that his theories were being squelched because he was in Russia. And it wasn't until much later, when others were actually discovering the same things, that his work permanently influenced the way that we teach. So he's very much that sociocultural. So you think of social groups, cultural, sociolinguistics. Linguistics is language. So he believes that you do not learn to read and write in isolation. You do not learn to read and write by yourself. Rather, you learn to read and write through the influence of others who are a little bit more knowledgeable. So he came up with this thing called the zone of proximal development that you may have heard of. If not, write that down. It's also known as ZPD. So people can accomplish more challenging tasks in groups with the help of others. What's an offshoot is this concept of sociocultural theory, in which reading and writing are viewed as social activities that reflect the culture and the community. So understanding the context of where your students come from, you'll hear about that in your internship, matters. Knowing who your kids are and where they come from, their background, just like Chibi, knowing a little bit more about who he is and where he comes from made a difference. And that's the difference between the first teacher and then Mrs. Mr. Isobe, I think is what I like to say is his name. Multicultural literature is another very important influence on being able to support learners through sociocultural theory. And that's one of the things we will do. One of our activities is reading multicultural literature. Situated learning theory is something else that comes from it, and that is this concept of apprenticeship. So you learn, when you take a student to the guided reading table, for example, you are the master. You are guiding students at their level. You are that more knowledgeable other. You're the mentor, and you are teaching students in those small groups in a situated learning in a setting. Situated learning theory could also be maybe going through a science experiment with a scientist who is, or somebody who has already done this experiment, being able to guide students. So it's that apprenticeship concept. And then there's critical literacy, which involves reading and responding to books that deal with social issues. So there's sociolinguistics has completely transformed the way that we teach. So Levi-Gotsky's theories are very influential. So he says that knowing your students and where they come from matter. This is just to remind you that we do have classrooms filled with people with many different backgrounds, cultures, and languages as well. We all know that. Information processing is another theory which compares the mind to a computer, as it describes how information runs through a series of units and it's all stored in your brain in different areas, yet those things are related. And this is the idea that in your computer, in your brain that's processing information, you start to make connections. If you think about what we just talked about a few minutes ago with the brain has these synapses, it has these tendons that actually grow and they flourish and they multiply with more input, more comprehensible input that helps the learner to become a better reader because they understand what they're reading and understand the concepts related to being taught well. So one of the things, the theories that has come from this information processing category is transactional theory, and you will hear more about that, authored by Louise Rosenblatt. And her transactional theory, for example, influences an entire strand in our TEKS called reader response. Strategic behaviors such as metacognition is thinking about your own thinking. And we practice this in the lessons when we ask our students not to just memorize something, but to really think about how they're learning and what works for them. So they're thinking about their own thinking. So information processing is also very, very huge. And we need to be aware of how our individual learners, which do they need? Do they need behaviorism? Do they need a little bit of constructivism? Or do you need to tap into some of the transactional theories of information processing, or a little bit of each? So again, it's your computer. All these different things are influencing your brain. Think of your brains up there, and you've got the sensory, short-term, long-term. Your brain's tapping into all of those different areas. Part of that comes from this thing called schema theory. David Rumelhart created this thought in the 1980s, and you're going to hear about schema. Think of it as your background knowledge. You can write that down for short. It describes how knowledge is acquired and processed and organized in your brain, all of these different areas. And it taps into comprehension and word knowledge. It taps into thinking about your knowledge as being a network. Well, your brain is also a network. And so Rumelhart talks about schema as being the building blocks of cognition. So if your students have a lot of background knowledge, chances are they're going to make those connections more securely. Chances are they're going to learn more effectively because things make sense, because they have anchors on which to hang that new knowledge. So this is not a Ferris wheel on the left, but what it is more like a web. And when they think, for example, of an egg, then they think, oh, they make a connection to a bird. Oh, and feathered and winged and warm-blooded, and then even different classes of birds and different names of birds. So there's connections constantly being built. That is schema theory. It is huge and it matters, which is why building your children's background knowledge matters to help them become effective readers. So I'm not going to take time to talk about this right now, but I would like you to just think about, okay, which one of these theories is the most popular? And which one of these theories influenced you as a learner when you were learning to read? You'll be writing about that in your discussion posts this week. Principle 2 talks about reading teachers needing to create a community of learners. Why? Look at what sociocultural learning is all about. Classrooms are social settings. Teachers and students need to be in a community that feels safe and respectful. And when that occurs, then we know that learning can take place. So it involves safety, respect, developing high expectations, providing opportunities for students to be able to take a risk, to collaborate, offer them choice, and involve their families. Principle 3. It talks about effective teachers supporting students' use of the cueing systems. You're going to need to learn what they are. Phonological, phono means sound, okay? That's how you remember what phonological is. You're going to hear phonemic, phonological, all of that. You're going to hear it over and over again. It's huge. And we talked about that brain part where the sound input, we hear sounds before anything else. And that influences our ability and how we learn to read. Syntactic is the structure of the language. It's the structure of the words. You can see, of course, that's very much influenced by phonics. Semantic has to do with the meaning of our language, the meaning of words, because we know that one word looks the same in two different settings, but it has two different meanings. So that's part of comprehension. And then there's the pragmatic, which is the social and the cultural uses, which of course goes right back into sociocultural learning. So we know that, again, background and schema matter in terms of the pragmatic and being able to build on all this. So a child that does not have a good sound basis, it does not have a good schema for phonological learning, etc. Principle 4, adopt a balanced approach to instruction. Well, we talked a little bit about what that is. We know that reading is complex, although some teachers do take a simple view towards certain types of instruction. You can't ignore that when you get at the end of the day, there's a lot of activity going on in that brain. Look at all those lobes that we were looking at. Those all get crossed, which means then because it is complex, it's a process. Think about it. It's a complex process. A process indicates that there's a lot of input, which requires then that you have explicit instruction in order for those strands that you saw in that rope to be able to be better entwined, to make readers become more effective and efficient. Reading instruction must be interactive. It must include guided practice, independent reading and writing, and literacy immersion, which is why you want children to be filled with books. I think sometimes people get the wrong notion that things like the science of teaching reading means take all the books out of the classroom. Not by any stretch of the mind. Balanced approach includes reading, literature, and writing. And some of the explicit instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. But you also teach it through explicit instruction through content area study and literacy strategies and skills, oral language and spelling. Principle 5 and 6 is dealing with scaffolding, reading and writing, and your opportunities to organize specifically for instruction. So scaffolding is done by modeling, for example, modeling your reading, modeling your writing, by shared reading and writing experiences where you're reading with children and involving them in the reading, the acts of reading together as a class or a small group. It's interactive reading and writing. It's guided and it's independent. It's when you're organizing, you think about the units, how are you making connections across the literature. You're organizing specifically to make sure that guided reading table is functional and that you have an opportunity for that. That takes a tremendous amount of organization. While you're working with that small group, something has to happen with the rest of the kids. You might organize by choosing a textbook or literature units. You might have literature circles, or you might have reading and writing workshops. All those are different approaches and ways to organize for literacy instruction in the classroom. It also means that you're thinking about the 5 pillars of reading instruction. And once you get this PowerPoint, oops, I thought I had, that should be linked up there. I'm gonna have to go back and check. I linked it, but I don't know where it went. But think of this. I included 2 images because I like them both. The first one is pillars. They're clearly pillars and they support the reader. So you have phonemic awareness. You're teaching specifically vocabulary, phonemic awareness, phonics and word study, fluency, and and you're teaching specific skills in comprehension. Absolutely. And we'll be talking about those in this course. But what I want you to recognize is what I like about the puzzle piece on the side is that, remember I said that at the end of the day, all of those things, vocabulary, fluency, phonics, and phonemic awareness, they lead to comprehension. And at the end of the day, we read to comprehend. Number 7 is talking about differentiating instruction. There's 3 things. You will be asked to write lesson plans, yes. And differentiation is going to be an element of your lesson plans. So write this down. There are 3 ways you differentiate: content, process, and product. You differentiate by what you ask, what you include in terms of your lessons, what the content of your lessons, of your reading, of your instruction. But you also differentiate by changing how you teach them through that process, because your children will respond uniquely according to how their brains are wired and who they are. But you might also differentiate it by what you expect them to produce at the end of the day, the end of the lesson, at the end of the unit. Some students are better ready to write a paragraph, are better ready to write a sentence, or better ready to write an essay. For example, there's lots of ways. Some are going to do reader response. Others are going to write a play. Just depends, to show their comprehension, for example. Principle 8, links assessment and instruction. And we know that all of that has to do with that lesson planning cycle. You plan, you monitor, you evaluate how they're doing. Evaluating is more of grading and such. You're monitoring, watching. You're evaluating but you're evaluating not just to grade, but to think, what's my next step? What is this child able to do? What is this child not yet able to do? You make choices, you make decisions. Teachers make millions of decisions in a day. You don't realize it. That's why you go home tired at the end of the day. And you start all over again and you plan, because assessment today drives instruction. And so I want you to think. I want you to think about Crowboy in the book that you saw early on. And I want you to think about all of these elements that are in chapter 1, about the learning theories and the elements of effective literacy instruction. Which ones did Mr. Isobe use? How was his instruction different from that first teacher that Chibi experienced? And how is Chibi's story relevant to education today? I don't have a discussion post for this. It's merely something for you to reflect on as you think about how this might influence you and your experience as you are observing. Are you seeing Chibis? Are you seeing how, what are the teachers you're observing doing to make their literacy instruction effective? What are you noticing in terms of some of the learning theories that you've already read about in this chapter. So this is a framework to help guide some of the things that that I would like you to look for while you're observing in the classroom. So we've talked about what teachers do to be effective. We talked a little bit about how effective teachers understand their students a little bit in order to become effective. And we've talked a little bit about why some of those things are important toward literacy instruction. It's a lot of information that I've just covered extremely fast, but hopefully it'll give you some basis and understanding of hearing it this way and support you while you're reading that chapter, which I know is a little bit dense. So just to get back to this concept that we started with at the beginning of the presentation relative to reading and the brain, I want you to think about this. I'm trying to remember her first name, Wolf. It was a very famous researcher that really began this trajectory and led us toward the science of teaching reading, and because she studied dyslexia when she was a medical doctor, and her own child was having trouble reading. And so she started to explore a little bit more and ended up writing a book about dyslexia and connecting it to brain science. And she says that we were never born to read. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago. Think about it. We were born to talk, because if you look at the bottom second bullet, vision and spoken languages are the only pre-programmed processes in our brain. Think about your children. My grandson definitely talks. He's 2 and he talks nonstop. He's very auditory and he's very verbal. But he has to be explicitly taught the elements of reading and language in order to be able to become a reader when it's his time. So the idea of reading and the brain is that our brains have this concept called plasticity. It's a neural plasticity because which allows our brains to learn and reorganize and restructure themselves. So you don't see all these lines in that picture of the brain, but you begin to recognize that these synapses grow stronger through all of those things that we talked about, especially schema theory. Yet reading is biological, it's cognitive, and it's cultural historical. So that ties back into sociocultural learning theory. So all of those theories have a place in understanding how our children learn to read. You just have to figure out what they look like and how are they being implemented in the classroom. One of the activities that you're being asked to do this week has to do with 7 short videos. I think you'll find them interesting. They start out being narrated by this guy right here, who used to play the Fonz. If you happen to watch Happy Days way back when, and it's there, all these videos are listed in, what is it? Reading Rockets. So you might want to be able to go, you can click here to find that link. But some of the important people that you might have heard about in your lifetime are dyslexic, and people who've struggled to read: Cher, Anderson Cooper, Robin Williams, Keira Knightley, Albert Einstein, Pablo Picasso, and Whoopi Goldberg. All of these people struggled, and look at how famous they became. So these videos you will find interesting, that I hope so, and you'll be able to write about that in one of our discussions. I also want you to think about this. Just think, you don't have to write about it. Does reading instruction, based on all the things we said, does it change when you incorporate digital tools? Many of you have told me in your survey that you bought or you rented the digital book. That changes how you're learning to read. That changes your reading and in your interaction. Your kids are now starting to take their STAR test digitally. We teach them to read with paper and pencil and books, and I always taught them to annotate and use pencil and paper, and yet we're having things to do with, we have to teach them through computers now. It really changes things. So I might ask you later, what's your experience with reading an e-text as opposed to reading the hard copy book? And some of you, of course, bought that book. I have both. I'm still old fashioned, but I do a lot on the computer. So here's the two discussions you have for this week. Number one, in fact, I've got them listed here, but what I think I might do is just take you straight to D2L. Can you still see this? Okay, good. Thank you very much. So let me go and right here, and I'm going to go to content because I want to make sure the viewers can see where this is listed in D2L. We're in week 2. And so you click on week 2 and you can see this is the overview of what you're going to do for the week. And oh, there's the Zoom that I was looking at. That's a different number, isn't it? Oh dear. I'm going to have to get this Zoom business sorted out. I'm sorry if there was confusion. I will get that sorted out for the next time we meet. So here's the presentation, which I will actually make visible to all of you now so that you can see it and you can hear and I'll post the video as soon as it's available. Number one, I want you to think about the literacy history that you wrote and submitted. I'm anxious to read them and I'll read them within the next 24 to 48 hours and give you some feedback. And it's not really for me as much as it is for you to start reflecting on how you learn to read and how that's going to influence you becoming a teacher. So this time though, I want you to post in your discussion. It's almost like that was a rehearsal for being able to answer 3 questions in your discussion post. So number 1, connect what you know about your experiences to the learning theories described in chapter 1. Describe what learning theory you believe is most represented in the literacy education you received. Be sure to use examples, of course, to support your thoughts or your conclusions. And some of you will say, I don't know because I don't remember certain things. You can only write about what you do know. So hopefully this experience that you just went through with the writing will give you some opportunity to think about, well, how did I learn all this stuff? Because we're not conscious, we don't think about it, but I've asked you to be conscious of it. Whoops, excuse me, I didn't mean to do that. Let me open this up. All right, number 2, consider the components of balanced literacy. We talked about that in this video, it's in the book. How does this approach, how does it compare to, how does how you learn to read compare to what we understand to be the balanced literacy approach or instruction? Include a description of balanced literacy, explain it, describe it, and then use examples to support your thinking. And number 3, consider the elements of differentiated instruction and assessment. And I actually even give you page numbers to the different sections in the book to help guide your thinking as you work through this, and explain what stands out to you about your own literacy instruction in terms of differentiation and assessment. Did you have it? Did you not have it? What did it look like? Consider, oh, we just went through that. Now, here's what's really important. You need to post your first response, your initial post by Sunday. That's due Sunday. And that's worth, I believe it's 15 points, okay? Then for an additional 5 points, you have to respond to others. So I'm not putting you in groups at this particular time because I'm not ready yet. I want you to get used to certain things in the course before, and I'll be asking you about how you want to proceed with that. So you pick 2 students. Some of you will pick the first 2 students on the list. Others, you might want to read around and see, well, which ones do I want to respond to, or who didn't get a response? So, and it'll, you guys handle that, but you can respond to more, but you have to respond to 2 other people's and be thoughtful and courteous when responding, make connections, ask questions, add value to the discussion as you talk about and share your own experiences in relationship to the reading. Or if that person is not talking about it, not addressing the prompt, you might draw them out. If they're addressing the prompt, but they're not connecting it to the text, help them. give them some thoughts. Maybe there's something that you can do to advance that discussion. So this is an opportunity for you guys to engage with the material and support each other. So this is the other important thing. The deadline for being able to do your responses is Wednesday, because you'll have some other stuff due on Sunday. So the cycle is initial responses on Sunday. Don't be late. Responses to those discussions are due on Wednesday. If we were face-to-face, we'd be doing this in class, but we're not. So I'm scattering it to give everybody opportunity, the opportunity to read and each other's work and be able to move forward. The other thing that I want you to recognize is that your post will not be visible to others until you've posted. So you can't read everybody. Well, you have to post before you get to read anything else. All right, then you get to read, okay, and read everybody else's. The second discussion post, also due on Sunday with a response on Wednesday, includes going through the videos. I want you to watch those. After watching them, think about what you've learned about these principles and instruction about how the brain learns to read, and connect them to your future classroom. So I ask you to write an initial response of about 350 words. And then, and within that, I want you to include references to something that you saw in the video or that you read in that article, or both. So you might structure it something like, for example, in video 1 or video 3, or in this article, I learned that, therefore I believe this. It does not have to be APA format. I just want you to make it make sense. Then respond to 2 other class members by Wednesday. Again, consider posting a connection, a conclusion, an observation, or an inquiry. Advance the conversation. It does not have to be as long, say about 250 words. And there you have it. That's your work for the week. The only other thing that I'm going to do is show you one last thing that was in this. That what I have on these 2 slides is exactly what I just shared with you. And that's this thing called the status of the class. Midweek, I will send out a status of the class, which is a Google form. And I did last week. I got about 16 responses, which is about half of the class. I do ask that you respond to those. I'm not making them lengthy. It's not a test, but I do need to get a pulse of the class because it helps me to know where to go. If we were face-to-face, I'd be reading your body language. I'd be reading your eyes. I would be listening to your commentary. But in an online class, we have to find other ways for us to engage. And although I respect tremendously the different places that you're coming from and your different working times and all the many, many things that you're juggling, giving me feedback allows me to be able to respond to you. And it is part of you engaging in the course. I know that my students have told me over time that you like, well, Sunday's my day to do all my work for this class because I have other courses. I respect that. So go ahead, and I will always try to give you enough time to get things done. So by Sunday, you know what your work is, but then know that you'll have to pick that by Wednesday, you're going to have some other smaller tasks. And you can always read ahead because I posted the material and opened up module 3, at least the reading portion for those of you that just work that way. I want to support you, so help me do that by responding to these forms. And that's it. That's my presentation for today. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. I'm going to stop this recording, and if any of you that are online present right now would like to ask questions, I'm here for you. Becca, you're not online. You're just online with me. Is there anything I can do to help you? Thank you for coming and joining us.
The only thing I wanted to know is like the study notes that you gave us.
Yes.
I printed those out. Is this what's going to be kind of like on our exams?
Your exams are going to be multiple choice, and they come directly from the book. So the those note catchers, for lack of anything better. The note catchers are purely for your use, for you to be able to take notes. So the information will come from the book. So I guess the answer is yes, but is it going to include all of that? No, some of it might be situational. So that's why I'm leaving that purely up to you. Because everyone learns differently, and some people want a guided outline to be able to follow. And others will take notes in their book and they don't need that. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I can't be more specific what will be on in the exam because they're strict. They're written by the publisher and they're directly related to the book. So you do have to read the book.
Okay. Which I'm doing that, but is it open? Is the exam like be an open exam, or is?
You read my mind. I was about to say, but
Okay.
the exams will be open book.
Okay. Okay.
I do not believe in memorization exams, not for what I teach. Because, first of all, I want you to read, and I want you to read a lot, and I want you to reread, and I expect you're going to have to reread because, oh my gosh, this is a lot of information. And it's maybe a little bit new to you, and it might be a little bit overwhelming. And so effective readers read and reread, and you're going to expect the same thing of your students. So I would not deprive you of that opportunity.
Yeah, I've always had a problem with reading. Like I do better like in person because I'm more of a visual learner than I am. But anyway, so I'm just kind of curious because I mean, I can sit here and take notes and notes and notes, and then if it's not an open book or whatever, well, you'll see how it is when you read my literacy history.
Okay, well, I'm very anxious to read that. And the other thing is that I realize that you're all a little bit lost or at a loss because you don't know exactly what notes to take. There's a lot. I know that. So that's why I'm hoping that some of these little presentations will kind of give you some of the highlights. And if you hear it once from me, then you read it, and then you do some writing about it, and then you do some discussion, it'll all start to make more sense. And you're starting to build your schema. You're building your background information a little bit at a time. I'm going to tell you that when I started my graduate work, for example, when I went into my PhD program, oh my gosh, I thought I was going to die. And I thought I knew how to read pretty good. I thought I knew stuff because my I'm a graduate student, right? And I've been teaching for years, and I'm a grown adult. And they gave me articles to read. I did not know that I was going to survive. I worked so hard to comprehend them. And it was really, really, really hard work. And I had to write about it. And I struggled. But then I found out, I figured something out. I figured out that if I read for purpose, it makes it easier. Because you're going, okay, what purpose? I got to consume it all. So I get that. That's why I try to, the notes and things that I talk about in our presentations might help. But the second thing is I began to recognize that maybe I was year 2 or 3 into my program. It took me 10 years to get my doctorate, by the way. But I'm several years into my program, and I kept hearing the same thing in different ways. Or I might hear another facet of this world of literacy and reading. And I began to experience it, and I'd be talking to my fellow classmates, or I'd be writing a paper, or I'd be doing some research, and I'd go, now I get it. Or that connects to something else I read. And so all of these different experiences, I was constructing my own learning by doing this work that was very, very hard. So nothing that I grade is a gotcha because I know that. I know what that experience was for me, and I expect that you're all experiencing something similar. You only have a semester, and I know you can only consume so much. So I'm going to try to give you different ways of getting at the material that I hope will make sense to you. and hook on those brains so that web is going to get bigger and bigger for you. But
Yes.
take it one step at a time and breathe in between.
Yeah.
That help a little bit?
I don't know if anybody has asked you yet or not, but on the 3 activities, we are now required, instead of doing 3 activities, we have to do 15 hours.
Yes.
Can it be the same as our intro to teaching, or does it have to be 2 different?
Good question. No, it's for the intro to teaching, you're doing 30 hours. 15 of those hours have to be for me,
Yes.
but you can also turn them in for her.
Yes.
So 15 of them can be literacy. Now you're going to be doing, are you also doing 3 activities for that teacher?
Yes, as well.
Okay, because I know every center is a little different. So essentially, a little tricky. Whatever she may say, you can do 15 hours. I mean, you can do activities, but you might be doing something math related or something science related. You can't use that for me. So the 3 activities you do for me have to be literacy related. And I don't know what activities she's going to require you to do for her class.
Okay, yeah, because on the thing or whatever that Misty has sent us out, it just said 3 activities, but then when we met with her Thursday, she had said that she had got new information about it being 15 hours, but some of our classmates that were there were also taking your class, and we're like wondering if, okay, well, those 15 hours count towards you as well, but if it's just literacy, just like reading it only, then we'll have to do 2 different ones.
Well, this is what most students have done. You do 2 reading logs, you do 2 logs, but you turn in the reading hours into her, because you're going to turn it into TK20 for reading for LED 300, and you're going to turn it into your reading 350 binder, which we would call those binders in TK20.
Yes.
But for LED 300, you have to turn in 30 hours. So those 30 hours will be whatever she tells you, and she will accept 15 of them being literacy or reading related. Does that make sense?
Yes, and she did say that, but we were just kind of concerned on the activities because she was like, if Dr. Slay says that it's okay, whatever activities you use for me to use for her, then that's fine. But she didn't know if you were going to have it to where it has to be just strictly like reading.
Yes.
Okay, so and we were kind of.
Yes. So if you do only reading activities for her, then that's her deal. I will not interfere. But for me, they have to be reading activities.
Okay.
Because TA will look at it and go, this is a reading class. Why are you doing that?
And I noticed that when I did on the TK20, I put math for your thing when I should have put reading, because I was doing my observation things, and when I did it, I was like, oh man, I did it the wrong way.
Okay, so lots of time. It's the beginning of the semester. Just
yeah, but I like it, where I started doing the reading of the chapter 1 and all that stuff because I was subbing today and started doing some observation stuff, and but it's very interesting so far. So
good. Well, was the presentation today helpful?
It was. I was sitting here writing notes, and like especially with the 5 pillars and all that, I would have never. That made sense, and then the front lobe and all, and the frontal lobe and all that. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting because I never really thought of it that way. So, because I don't use big vocabulary words, I try to stay away from that because there's some of them that I just can't. I don't understand. And then on top of that, I'm dyslexic, so I'm like, okay, I keep going back and make sure that I have like the right information and stuff. So, But
Okay, we all learn it a different way. And so let's make this work for you. You let me know how I can support you.
yes, ma'am, I appreciate it.
So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Hey, no problem.
You. All right. Have a good
Uh,
night.
You too.